That's not a typo, and it's not propaganda. That's a body count for a navy that, on paper, doesn't officially exist. Russia's so-called shadow fleet, the aging, rust-streaked armada quietly built to smuggle oil past Western sanctions. And in the last 7 days, it has been torn apart by machines that cost less than a used car, flown by operators sitting in bunkers hundreds of miles away. If you've been watching this war for 4 years, you know Ukraine has hit tankers before. One here, two there, a mysterious explosion off Malta, a fire off Libya, a story that flares up for a news cycle and disappears. This is different. This is not a raid. This is a campaign, sustained, coordinated, industrial in scale. And it's happening in a sea most Western audiences couldn't find on a map, the Sea of Azov, the narrow, shallow body of water wedged between southern Ukraine and Russia, the last lifeline keeping fuel flowing into occupied Crimea. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why this week matters more than almost anything else that's happened in this war since the counteroffensive stalled, and why the Kremlin's own oil minister is about to have a very bad month. One quick thing before we go further. If you want more of this kind of sharp, no fluff military analysis, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you think this war goes next. Let's lay out the timeline because the sequencing here tells its own story. On July 6th, Ukrainian drone units hit two tankers, the Kapitan Barman and a Prime Max class vessel called Sanar 3, small, almost a warm-up. On July 7th, 10 vessels were hit, including 8 tankers, 1 cargo ship, and 1 ferry, the SKS-1, caught right at the port of Kerch. Reuters confirmed Ukraine's drone forces said they'd struck 8 sanctioned vessels in the Sea of Azov, each carrying a dead weight of around 7,000 tons. Then July 8th, 9 more vessels, tankers with names like Efrosinya Fif and Maria, cargo ships called Donstar and Vladimir. Some of these ships got hit twice in 48 hours, patched up just enough to move and hit again. And then July 9th, the night that turned this from a story into a headline, Ukraine reportedly struck 14 Russian vessels in a single overnight operation, 12 of them oil tankers believed to be part of Moscow's shadow fleet. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Madyar Brovdy, posted the tally himself on Telegram. 35 tankers, cargo ships, and support vessels struck in just 96 hours. He didn't hedge, he didn't soften it. He said the shadow fleet was thinning. By the close of the week, factoring in the follow-on strikes through July 12th, the total climbed to approximately 90 vessels hit in Ukraine's multi-day operation across the Sea of Azov. 90 in a body of water barely 340 kilometers across, smaller than Lake Michigan. Think about the logistics of that for a second. This isn't one lucky drone finding one unlucky tanker in open ocean. This is a saturation campaign, night after night, wave after wave, hitting ships faster than Russia can patch, insure, or replace them. Brovdi described the results in blunt language on Telegram, calling the strikes industrial-level results, adding that fuel tanks were badly damaged and burning. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Russia has reportedly started disguising fuel shipments as water and milk tankers, trying to hide military logistics from Ukrainian drone operators. The tactic has become common enough that Ukrainian crews now treat any tanker-shaped vessel heading toward Crimea as a probable fuel target, regardless of what it claims to be carrying. Let that sink in. A nuclear-armed state, 4 years into a full-scale war, is now painting milk on the side of fuel tankers to try to survive drone strikes from a country with a fraction of its GDP. That is not the posture of a confident empire. That's the posture of a fleet in genuine crisis. You already know the basics, so let's go past them. The Shadow Fleet isn't some clever nickname. It's a real deliberate architecture built by the Kremlin specifically to defeat Western sanctions. Here's how it works. After the G7 price cap and EU sanctions hit in 2022, Russia couldn't openly sell oil above the capped price using Western-flagged, Western-insured tankers. So Moscow built a parallel shipping economy. Aging tankers, often decades past their safe operating life, purchased through shell companies, reflagged to places like Gambia, Panama, or the Comoros, insured, if insured at all, through obscure providers with no real capacity to pay out on a catastrophic spill, no transponders, no accountability. ghost ships essentially moving hundreds of millions of dollars of crude and refined product every single week. Industry estimates now suggest this fleet has swollen to more than 1,500 tankers, allowing Moscow to keep exporting oil despite years of Western sanctions. 1,500. That's not a workaround anymore. That's a second merchant marine built in the shadows, specifically to fund an army. And this is the argument Kiev has been making to the world loudly for over a year now. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba wrote directly to the International Maritime Organization after Russia accused Ukraine of terrorism on the high seas. Kuleba pushed back hard, arguing that legitimate questions exist about whether these vessels can really be considered ordinary commercial operations at all. His position, in plain English, these aren't civilian ships. They're war financing infrastructure wearing a civilian disguise, and under that logic, they're fair targets. You can agree or disagree with that framing. Plenty of maritime lawyers will spend the next decade arguing over it, but you cannot deny the effect it's having. Because a tanker fleet built specifically to be untraceable, unaccountable, and disposable turns out to have a fatal weakness. Nobody's rushing to defend ships nobody officially owns. Now, here's where the human stakes come in, because this isn't an abstract shipping story. This is about a peninsula quietly running out of gas. The Sea of Azov strikes are part of a deliberate mounting Ukrainian effort to isolate Russian-occupied Crimea, cutting off the fuel that keeps the peninsula and the Russian forces stationed there running, and it's working. Ukraine's intensified campaign against logistics and energy infrastructure in Crimea has sparked real fuel shortages and forced authorities to declare a state of emergency across the territory. Picture that for a second. This is Crimea, the crown jewel Putin annexed in 2014, the propaganda centerpiece of Novorossiya, the beach resort turned military fortress. And in July 2026, there are lines at gas stations in Simferopol. Real lines, real people, real anger, photographed by the Associated Press. This isn't a Ukrainian claim anymore. It's visible on the ground. It gets worse for Moscow from there. Russia introduced an outright ban on diesel exports as part of a package of emergency measures to protect its domestic fuel market after systematic Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries triggered gasoline shortages and price spikes. Read that sentence again. Russia, one of the largest oil-producing nations on the planet, has had to ban exporting diesel because it can't guarantee supply to its own citizens and military. That's not a footnote. That's a nation's energy infrastructure buckling under sustained asymmetric pressure. And Crimea specifically is the pressure point because it's a peninsula. Everything that reaches it, fuel, ammunition, food for the garrison, has to travel across a narrow strip of land through the Kerch Strait or by sea across the very waters Ukraine is now hunting in every single night. Cut the sea lane and Crimea becomes an island under siege dependent entirely on a single bridge that's already been bombed twice. This is the strategic logic behind the 90 ships. It was never really about the tankers themselves. It's about turning Crimea from Russia's unsinkable fortress into Russia's most expensive liability. Now, you're a sophisticated audience, so let's talk about how a country with no real navy is achieving this. Ukraine doesn't have a blue water fleet. It barely had a navy at all after 2022. Russia sank or captured most of what existed in the war's opening weeks. What Ukraine built instead was something the world hadn't really seen at scale before: a drone navy. Sea Baby unmanned surface vessels, essentially remote-controlled speedboats packed with explosives, cheap enough to build in the hundreds, expendable enough to lose without a second thought. Magura V-5 naval drones, sleek and low-profile, designed to skim the surface undetected until the moment of impact. And critically, this isn't confined to the Black Sea anymore. In March, the sanctioned tanker Arctic Metagaz caught fire off Malta carrying 62,000 tons of LNG, and an investigation later attributed the strike to a Ukrainian-made Magura V-5 drone launched from the Libyan coast near Melita, striking the vessel's engine room, Libya, off the coast of Libya. Ukraine, or forces working with Ukraine, launched a naval drone from North Africa to hit a Russian tanker in the central Mediterranean. That detail alone should terrify Moscow's shipping insurers more than anything happening in the Azov Sea this week, because it means there is no safe water anymore, not the Black Sea, not the Mediterranean, not the routes to Turkey, not the routes past Malta, not even ships flagged under sleepy third-party nations with no connection to the war. In January, a Shadow Fleet tanker called the Elbis was struck by a drone off the coast of Turkey while heading toward the Russian port of Novorossiysk. The Sea of Azov campaign is the loudest chapter, but it's really the domestic front of a much bigger, quieter war being fought against Russia's oil economy across 3 seas and 2 continents. The drones in Azov are the visible surge. The Libya strike is the warning shot that says, we can reach you anywhere. And the economics here are brutal for Russia in a way that should matter to you, even if you don't care about naval warfare. A Sea Baby drone costs somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars. A Shadow Fleet tanker, even an aging, sanctioned, barely insured one, represents millions in cargo and vessel value, plus the geopolitical cost of losing sanctioned oil revenue at a moment Russia's economy is already straining under a wartime budget. This is the most lopsided cost-exchange ratio of the entire war. Ukraine is winning an economic war using the cheapest weapons in its arsenal. Let's not pretend this is bloodless because it isn't, and a serious commentary owes you the full picture. In one incident off the Turkish coast, the tanker Mid-Volga II was struck approximately 80 nautical miles out while carrying sunflower oil from Russia to Georgia, and the attack, likely from a shrapnel-equipped drone, injured both the master and the second engineer. Real crew members, real injuries. Ukraine's foreign ministry denied involvement in that particular strike and accused Russia of staging it, a reminder that in this war, even the attacks themselves have become contested narratives weaponized for propaganda on both sides. And Russia hasn't been passive, it's been retaliating, not just rhetorically, but with strikes of its own. Following a wave of Ukrainian tanker attacks, Russia launched a Shahed kamikaze drone at a Turkish-owned cargo ship, the San-KT, docked in the Ukrainian port of Chornomorsk, widely read as direct retaliation. A Turkish-flagged ship, a NATO member's commercial vessel caught in the crossfire of a war neither side officially admits is being fought at sea. And it cuts both ways in terms of the numbers, too. Russia has attempted somewhere between 15 and 18 attacks on Ukrainian commercial shipping in the past year, damaging roughly 28 vessels, according to Ukrainian maritime security researchers. This is not a one-sided turkey shoot happening in a vacuum. It's an escalating maritime war where merchant shipping, supposedly protected under international law, has become just another battlefield, and neutral flags are no longer a guarantee of safety. That should worry every shipping executive, every insurer, and frankly, every government with tankers moving anywhere near these waters. Because once you normalize striking sanctioned or suspicious vessels, the definition of what counts as a legitimate target has a way of creeping outward. Ask any maritime lawyer watching this unfold, and they'll tell you this is setting precedent nobody voted on. Here's the question that should really be keeping Kremlin officials up at night. Why can't Russia just protect its own fleet? The honest answer is structural, not tactical. The entire value proposition of the Shadow Fleet was built around anonymity and deniability. Cheap, unregistered, uninsured ships slipping past sanctions enforcement. But that same anonymity is now a fatal weakness. You can't request a naval escort for a ship that officially doesn't belong to you. You can't scramble air cover to protect a vessel flagged to Gambia that Moscow publicly insists has nothing to do with the Russian state. The entire architecture of deniability that let this fleet dodge Western sanctions for 3 years is the exact same architecture that leaves it defenseless now. Add to that the geography. The Sea of Azov is small, shallow, and largely surrounded by Ukrainian-controlled or contested coastline on one side. It's not the open Pacific, there's nowhere to hide, no room to disperse a convoy, no deep water to slip away into under cover of darkness. Every tanker heading toward Crimea has to funnel through the same narrow approaches night after night on largely predictable schedules dictated by fuel demand. That predictability is a gift to drone operators running reconnaissance. and Russian air defense stretched thin across a 2,000-kilometer front and increasingly tasked with defending refineries and power plants deep inside Russian territory, simply doesn't have the density to blanket every merchant route with effective counter-drone coverage. You can't be strong everywhere. Something has to give, and this month it was the Shadow Fleet. This is where it stops being a regional war story and starts being a global economic story. Every Shadow Fleet tanker that burns in the Azov Sea sends a signal through the entire underground insurance and shipping network that's kept Russian oil flowing around sanctions for 3 years. Insurers who were already charging enormous risk premiums for these routes are now looking at a strike rate that makes the math simply not work anymore. Ship owners, often obscure holding companies fronting for Russian interests, are facing a brutal calculation. Keep running the Azov gauntlet and risk losing a multi-million-dollar asset within days, or pull vessels out of rotation and watch Crimea's fuel crisis deepen further. We're already seeing the downstream effect. Recall that diesel export ban Moscow just imposed. That's not just about protecting domestic supply, that's an economy triaging itself, choosing which failures it can survive and which it can't. And remember, this comes on top of the systematic, ongoing Ukrainian drone campaign against Russian oil refineries deep inside Russian territory, a separate but connected front that's been quietly draining Russia's refining capacity for months. Put those two campaigns together, refineries burning at home, tankers burning at sea, and you get a fuel supply chain being attacked at both ends simultaneously, the source and the delivery. For the rest of the world, there's a quieter but very real question forming. What happens to global oil markets if Russia's illicit export capacity keeps eroding at this pace? Sanctioned oil that can't move is oil that either gets discounted even further to entice remaining buyers or simply doesn't reach market at all. Either way, that reshapes revenue flowing into the Kremlin's war chest, and a war chest running dry has a way of changing negotiating positions at the table faster than any diplomatic pressure ever could. Let's be the skeptic in the room for a second, because a good analyst doesn't just cheerlead the highlight reel. 90 ships sounds enormous, and it is enormous by the standards of this specific campaign, but context matters. Russia's Shadow Fleet is estimated at over 1,500 vessels globally. 90 damaged tankers, even if every single one is a permanent write-off, is roughly 6% of that total fleet. This is a devastating week, not a knockout blow. Russia isn't going to run out of tankers next month. But wars aren't won by single knockout blows anymore. They're won by attrition, by which side's economy and morale crack first under sustained pressure. And that's exactly the model Ukraine appears to be running here, not destroy the Shadow Fleet, but make operating the Shadow Fleet near Crimea so expensive, so unpredictable, and so lethal that insurers, ship owners, and Russian logistics planners simply can't sustain the tempo. A siege doesn't need to sink every ship, it needs to make every captain afraid to sail. And there's a psychological dimension here that shouldn't be underestimated. 4 years into this war, Western audiences have grown numb to frontline trench warfare updates. The town names blur together, the casualty figures become background noise. But burning tankers, on video, posted directly to Telegram by the commander who ordered the strikes, that's a different kind of story. That's visual, visceral, and it reframes the entire narrative of the war away from grinding stalemate and toward Ukrainian initiative. Perception matters in a war this long, both for Western aid packages and for Russian domestic morale watching fuel lines form in occupied Crimea. So where does this go from here? Watch three things over the coming weeks. First, watch whether Russia manages to reroute Shadow Fleet traffic away from the Azov choke point entirely, shifting more volume through longer, costlier routes around the Black Sea, or leaning harder on rail and pipeline alternatives to supply Crimea overland. If Ukraine's strikes have made Azov effectively unusable, that reroute itself is a strategic win even without another single tanker sunk. Second, watch the insurance and shipping markets. If premiums for Shadow Fleet routes spike further, or if ship owners quietly start pulling vessels from rotation, that tells you the deterrent effect is working even beyond the direct kills. Money talks louder than propaganda in this war. Third, and this is the one I genuinely keep an eye on, watch for further strikes outside the Black Sea theater entirely. The Libya-launched attack on the Arctic Metagaz near Malta wasn't a one-off. If Ukraine's drone forces have demonstrated they can reach sanctioned tankers in the central Mediterranean, that changes the entire risk calculus for every port, every insurer, and every flag of convenience shipowner doing business with Moscow anywhere in the world. That's not a regional war anymore. That's a global pressure campaign with a very long reach. Here's the bottom line, stripped of all the noise. Russia built an entire shadow economy to outlast Western sanctions. 1,500 ghost ships, unaccountable, undetectable, unsinkable in theory. And in 1 week, in one small, shallow sea most people can't name, a country with no real navy proved that theory wrong 90 times over. This isn't the war ending, it's not even close to that, but it is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential weeks of asymmetric naval warfare this century has produced. And it happened almost entirely off the front pages, buried under headlines about ceasefire talks and frontline stalemates that haven't moved in months. If you found this useful, drop a comment below telling me what you think happens to the Shadow Fleet next, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown when this story develops further, because it will.